two tiny Belgian Malinois puppies dangled beneath the frozen beams of a deck in the blizzard. Silent, frozen, forgotten by the world. Their cries were swallowed by the wind, their little hearts slowing with every snowflake that fell. But miles away, a former Marine raider named Logan Cross was driving through that same storm. A man running from memories, not missions.
Get in the cage right now.
His canine partner, Titan, suddenly raised his head. He'd heard something no human ear could catch. When Logan followed Titan into the whiteout, he found the two trembling lives that would change everything. Because sometimes the ones we save are the ones sent to save us. Winter had swallowed Montana whole. Snow drifted from the sky like powdered glass, relentless and silent, turning the forest into a world of white ghosts. The wind moaned through the pines, carrying with it the scent of ice and solitude. Somewhere along a forgotten mountain road, a single cabin stood half buried in snow. Its roof bent beneath the storm, its windows dim, its chimney coughing thin plumes of smoke that vanished as soon as they rose. It was not a place built for visitors. Inside, Logan Cross sat beside the fire, the orange light flickering across his face like a heartbeat. At 38, he still carried the presence of a soldier, tall, broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate and controlled. But there was a weight in his gaze that no training could erase. His dark brown hair had grown long enough to brush his collar, streaked with premature gray, and a short beard traced the square cut of his jaw. Those amber eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held the stillness of someone who had stopped expecting to be needed. He lived here alone with Titan, his 6-year-old Belgian Malinois. The dog's mahogany and black coat shimmered in the firelight, a jagged scar cutting across his right flank like a pale river through dark fur. Titan had once been a working canine in the Corps, fearless, loyal, trained to detect explosives beside Logan during endless desert nights. Now the two shared a quieter war, survival in silence. The storm howled outside, battering the windows like a living thing. Logan leaned back in the old wooden chair, running a calloused hand through his beard. He had learned to live without voices, without laughter, without purpose. Solitude had become his penance since the day a mission went wrong, and 3 of his brothers never came home. He could still hear their final radio call echoing in his head whenever the wind screamed too long. Titan's ears twitched. The dog lifted his head, muscles tensing. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Logan looked up, frowning. "What is it, buddy?" The dog didn't move, eyes fixed on the door. Logan listened. At first, there was nothing, only the sound of snow beating against wood. Then, faintly, beneath the roar of the wind, he heard it. A thin, desperate cry. He stood, his pulse quickening. "Stay," he whispered, but Titan was already on his feet, tail low, body rigid. Logan grabbed his coat, pulling it tight around his shoulders, and opened the door. The storm hit like a wall. Snow whirled into the cabin, biting his skin, blinding his vision. He stepped out, boots crunching deep into the drifts. The cry came again, so faint it could have been imagined. He swept the flashlight across the porch, then down toward the steps. Something moved beneath the support beam. 2 small shapes dangling from a frayed rope, barely visible under a crust of snow. For a second, he thought they were lifeless, until one trembled. His breath caught. They were puppies, tiny Malinois mixes, maybe 6 weeks old, hanging together, limp, their fur frozen solid. Jesus. Logan's voice broke through the storm. He dropped to his knees, fumbling at the rope with numb fingers. The knots were stiff with ice. "Hold on," he muttered through his teeth. "Hold on!" He tore the line loose and caught them against his chest. They were weightless, fragile. Their paws curled tight from cold. He tucked them into his coat and turned back toward the door, the wind slashing at his face. Inside, he kicked the door shut behind him and stumbled to the fire. His breath came in ragged bursts as he unzipped his coat and laid the two small bodies on a wool blanket. They didn't move. Their fur was dark and tan, like Titan's, but matted with snow and ice. He rubbed them with his palms, fast, firm, whispering under his breath. Come on, stay with me." Titan whined softly, circling them. The big dog lowered his head, sniffing the small, stiff forms. One puppy twitched, then another. A faint whimper cut through the silence. Logan's chest loosened. He reached for a towel, drying their tiny paws, their ears, their bellies. They began to shiver again. Good. That meant the blood was moving. He reached for a pot of water warming on the stove and dipped a finger into it, brushing it against their mouths. One licked weakly, then the other. Logan exhaled shakily, half laughing, half crying without realizing it. "You're fighters, huh?" The fire cracked behind him. He could feel its warmth climbing up his back as the room filled with steam from his wet coat. He sat cross-legged, wrapping the puppies together in an old flannel shirt. Titan lay down beside them, his large body radiating heat. One of the pups let out a squeaky sigh and burrowed against Titan's chest. Logan watched, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel hollow. He looked at Titan, who kept his gaze fixed on the fire, protective and calm. "Looks like we've got company, partner." Titan's tail thumped once against the floorboards as if in approval. Logan stared at the puppies, small enough to fit in his hands. Whoever had left them out there hadn't meant for them to be found. The thought twisted something inside him, an ache he recognized too well. People threw away what they couldn't handle. Missions, soldiers, lives. He had been both the rescuer and the abandoned. Maybe that was why the sight of these small creatures hit so deep. He found himself whispering, "You made it home." The word surprised him. Home. He hadn't used that word in years. He reached out and rubbed one of the puppies gently between the ears. "Ranger," he said, then looking at the other softer one that kept nuzzling Titan's paw. "And you'll be Ivy." The names felt natural, almost inevitable. The wind outside began to calm, its rage spent. Snow still fell, but slower now, drifting like feathers against the window. Logan leaned back, muscles trembling from the cold, and looked around the cabin, his small, quiet world suddenly filled with movement and breath. The firelight glowed across the floorboards, flickering against the rifles hanging on the wall, against the faded photo of a Marine team in desert sun. He could still see their faces, men who had trusted him, who never came home. For years, that loss had frozen him from the inside. But now, in the hush between the crackling logs, he heard something different. Not ghosts, not regret, just the steady rhythm of small hearts learning to live again. He placed another log on the fire and knelt beside the puppies. "You're safe now," he murmured, voice rough. The words half prayer, half promise. No more storms. Titan yawned and laid his muzzle across his paws, his eyes drifting shut. The puppies stirred, curling closer to him. Logan watched them for a long while, his breathing slowing with theirs. The fire's glow deepened, wrapping the room in gold. Outside, snowflakes still spun through the dark, catching the faint light that leaked from the cabin's single window. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that felt holy. Logan placed his hands close to the flames, feeling the sting fade from his fingers. He glanced once more at the two small lives that had appeared out of the storm, as if heaven itself had whispered their names into the wind. He sat back slowly, his body trembling, not from fear, but from something harder to name, a fragile warmth rising where cold had lived too long, the kind of warmth that could grow into faith if given time. Logan set the puppies a little closer to the fire, his hands shaking from exhaustion. Outside, the snow continued to fall, endless and soft. But inside the cabin, the tiny flames danced higher, casting light over man, dog, and the two newborn souls they'd saved. And as he whispered goodnight, his breath mingling with the crackle of wood, Logan didn't notice that the loneliness had already begun to thaw. The storm had passed, but the mountains still breathed frost. Morning light crept slowly across the snow like pale smoke, touching the frozen pines and the roof of Logan's cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low through the night, now just a cradle of embers glowing faintly beneath gray ash. Logan stirred awake in his chair. A blanket half slipped from his shoulders. The smell of smoke and wet fur lingered in the air. Titan was the first to move, stretching beside the hearth with a low groan, his tail sweeping the floor in lazy strokes. Beside him, the two puppies, Ranger and Ivy, lay huddled together in the flannel shirt Logan had wrapped them in. Their breathing was soft, shallow, but steady. Ivy, the smaller one, had a white patch on her chest like a crooked star, while Ranger's ears stood taller, as if already listening to the world with soldierly alertness. Logan leaned forward, rubbing his hands over his face. He hadn't slept properly, too afraid the puppy's tiny heartbeats might stop if he looked away too long. Yet they had made it. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured, voice rough with fatigue. Titan turned his head as if agreeing. He fed the fire, set a pot of water to warm, and crouched again near the puppies. When he gently touched Ranger's paw, the little creature stirred and let out a faint squeak that drew a quiet chuckle from Logan, a sound foreign even to his own ears. All right, he whispered. "You're home now." The word home felt fragile in his mouth, like something that might shatter if spoken too loud. Outside, daylight spread across the valley, catching the glint of ice on every branch. The wind had softened, carrying only the sighs of the forest. For the first time in months, the world around him didn't feel hostile. Still, the sight of the puppies brought back flashes, shards of memory he couldn't bury. A mission in the mountains of Afghanistan. The snow not so different from this. His team's voices on the radio. Then silence. The explosion. The ringing in his ears. The snow red against the white. Logan shook his head as if to scatter the ghosts. He poured warm milk into a small cup and dipped his finger in, letting Ivy lick at it weakly. Then Ranger. They drank slowly, fighting sleep with every sip. Titan lay nearby, watching over them with quiet patience, his scar glinting faintly in the firelight. A sudden knock startled Logan. Not the storm this time. An actual knock. He froze, the air seeming to tighten around him. Visitors didn't come up here. No one ever did. Titan stood, ears pricked, tail low but alert. The second knock was softer, hesitant. Logan pulled on his coat and moved to the door, hand resting on the handle. When he opened it, the cold rushed in, but so did the faint scent of cinnamon and pine. Standing there was an older woman wrapped in a thick brown coat, her gray hair pinned loosely beneath a knitted hat dusted with snow. Her cheeks were red from the wind, her breath visible in short puffs. "Good morning, Mr. Cross," she said, voice warm despite the cold. "I hope I'm not intruding." He blinked, surprised. "Mrs. Higgins?" Martha Higgins had been one of the few people who still lived year-round in Shadow Creek. She owned the old bakery down in town, famous for its apple bread. She was in her late 60s, small but steady, with soft wrinkles that deepened when she smiled, and eyes the color of faded denim. Kind, but sharp enough to see through a man. Her husband, a fire captain, had died years ago, saving a trapped child and a dog from a burning house. Since then, Martha had devoted her days to small kindnesses, baking for strangers, visiting the sick, and driving her old truck through storms to check on anyone too stubborn to ask for help. "I brought some food," she said, lifting a wicker basket covered with a cloth. "Heard the power lines went down again up here. Figured you'd be needing something that isn't canned beans." Logan stepped aside awkwardly. "You shouldn't be out on these roads." She smiled faintly. "I've been driving these mountains since you were in uniform, son. Snow won't scare me off." She entered, stamping her boots and looking around the cabin. "Still quiet as a church in here. You always keep it this clean?" "Old habit," he replied. Her gaze fell on the hearth, and her eyes softened. Oh, look at that." She crouched slowly, setting the basket down. "Puppies!" "They were out in the storm," Logan said, kneeling beside her, under the deck beam. "Someone left them tied up." Her brow furrowed. "Tied up?" "Lord above." She reached out a wrinkled hand to stroke Ivy's tiny head. The pup blinked up at her and gave a weak yawn. "Well, aren't you two little miracles?" Logan said nothing. Martha glanced up at him, seeing something in his face, something haunted but flickering with life. "You saved them," she said softly. He shrugged. "Just found them." "Finding's not the same as saving," she replied, standing with a small grunt. "Maybe you didn't stumble on them by accident. Sometimes God doesn't use lightning and trumpets, Mr. Cross. Sometimes he just uses the nearest fool willing to open a door." He almost smiled. "You think God sent me 2 half-frozen dogs?" Martha met his eyes. "I think he sent you a reason to care again." The words landed heavier than she meant them to. Logan looked away, pretending to tend the fire. She didn't press. Instead, she unpacked the basket. Warm bread, jars of soup, a small tin of honey. The scent of apples filled the air, blending with wood smoke. "You didn't have to," he murmured. "Sure I did," she said, brushing her gloves clean. "I had a husband once who couldn't walk away from someone in trouble. Fireman. ran into a house that was already half gone just to pull out a dog. They both made it out alive, but he never made it home from the next fire. I like to think he's still running towards something good." Her eyes glistened, but her voice didn't shake. "Sometimes the Lord sends us back just to love one more creature." Logan swallowed, unsure how to answer. He hadn't spoken this much to another person in months, maybe years. Something in Martha's calmness unsettled him. The way she spoke, as if grace were still possible. "Thank you," he said finally. Quiet, but sincere. She nodded, taking one last look at the puppies, now asleep against Titan's chest. "You take care of them. They're depending on you now." "I will." She buttoned her coat, pulling her scarf tighter. "Storm's coming again tonight. If you need anything, the church radio's still working. I'll check in by noon." He walked her to the door, the wind whistling faintly outside. She turned once more before stepping out, her eyes soft but knowing. "You're not as alone as you think, Mr. Cross. Not anymore." When she disappeared down the path, Logan stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the slow trail her boots left in the snow until it vanished into the trees. The wind carried only silence now, but it felt different, less empty. He closed the door and turned toward the hearth. Titan had already curled up again, his big body a living wall of warmth around the sleeping puppies. Ranger twitched in his sleep, letting out a tiny bark that made Logan laugh under his breath. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down, and stared into the fire. For the first time in years, the sound of life filled the cabin. The small breaths of the dogs, the faint crackle of logs, the echo of Martha's words lingering in the air. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle and unhurried. Inside, the cabin seemed to breathe. Logan leaned back, his eyes heavy but peaceful. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Martha's truck headlights winding down the mountain road, two beams of light fading into the white distance. He looked once more at the sleeping dogs and whispered, "You're safe now." And for the first time since he'd come to these mountains, the cabin no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a beginning. The storm had broken 2 days ago, but winter still ruled the mountains. The air was sharp enough to bite the skin, and the trees glittered under a pale morning sun like 1,000 frozen spears. Logan Cross stepped out from his cabin, boots crunching through the crust of new snow. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, his breath fogging in the cold behind him. Titan followed silently, the big Malinois' paws leaving neat prints beside his own. The two puppies, Ranger and Ivy, barked faintly from inside the cabin, their cries muffled by the wooden walls. Logan paused, listening. The forest had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that made every small sound a snapping twig. The brush of wind through pine feel heavy with meaning. Something in his gut told him the story of those puppies wasn't over. No one simply left 2 Belgian Malinois pups to die in the snow. Not this far out. Not tied up like that. He adjusted the strap of his pack, the one that still bore faint marine markings, and began down the trail that led toward the old bridge, the same bridge where he had found them hanging under the beam like discarded rags. Each step pressed deep into the snow, the air filled with a soft hiss of frost. Titan trotted a few paces ahead, his ears sharp, his breath coming out in short white bursts. The world seemed frozen in time until Logan reached the clearing by the river bend. The bridge stood silent, a weathered skeleton of wood, its railings half buried under ice. Beneath it, the snow had gathered thick and uneven, masking the earth below. He crouched near the beam where the rope had been tied, brushing away the new snow. The rope was gone, but faint impressions remained. 2 deep grooves where something heavy had rubbed against the wood. Then he saw them. Footprints. Large ones. Boots. Not his. The pattern was heavy tread. Wide spacing. Someone tall and heavy. There were at least 2 sets moving away from the bridge toward the tree line. He followed them for several meters, then stopped when he noticed another detail. A piece of torn rope, thick and synthetic, the kind used for securing cargo. Industrial rope, not something a hunter would carry. Logan picked it up, turning it between his fingers. This wasn't random, he muttered under his breath. Somebody wanted them gone. Titan barked once, short and low, and Logan's eyes swept the horizon. No fresh movement, no smoke, just the endless white. But his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in war, tightened like wire. He pocketed the rope, scanned the area once more, then turned back toward home. He needed to think. He needed to talk to Martha. By afternoon, the wind had picked up again, flurries of snow dancing through the pines as Logan climbed the ridge. The cabin appeared ahead, half hidden by frost. Martha Higgins's old truck sat parked out front, its red paint faded and dusted white. She stood near the porch, stamping her boots, a knitted scarf wrapped high around her chin. When she saw him, her face lit with relief. "You were gone all morning. I was about to send a search party." Logan smiled faintly. "Just went for a walk." Martha tilted her head. "That kind of walk doesn't need a knife and a pack, Mr. Cross." He set his bag down and leaned against the porch railing. "I went back to the bridge." Her eyes narrowed. "Find something?" He nodded slowly. Footprints, 2 sets, heavy boots, and a rope. Industrial, not farm grade. Whoever left those pups didn't just dump them. They wanted them dead. Martha's lips pressed tight. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she opened the wicker basket. She'd brought bread, soup, and something else. This time a folded sheet of paper. "I was hoping you'd be home," she said, handing it to him. "You need to see this." He unfolded it. It was a drawing, a rough pencil sketch of 2 men carrying something over their shoulders, maybe sacks or bags. The scrawl beneath read, "They took the crying bags into the woods." Logan frowned. "Who drew this?" "Toby Clark," she said quietly. "He's 10. Comes to Sunday school every week. His mama thought he was making up stories, but I know that boy. He doesn't lie. He said he saw 2 men near the old freight road 3 nights ago, just before the storm hit." Logan looked at her. "Did he see faces?" Martha shook her head. "Just dark coats and a white truck. He said one man laughed and said, 'Nobody's going to find them now.' He didn't understand what it meant. But I do." Her voice dropped. "They weren't the kind of men from around here." Logan folded the paper carefully. His pulse had begun to quicken again. Not from fear, but something sharper. Purpose. "You think they're still out there?" "I think people who do things like that don't disappear easy," she said, pulling her scarf tighter. "And I think those pups didn't end up under your deck by chance. Maybe God meant them to find you first." He almost laughed. But her tone left no room for cynicism. The wind howled through the pines, carrying a sound that made them both glance toward the tree line. Just the shifting of branches? Or something else? Martha sighed. You be careful, Logan. The world's not as quiet as it looks out here. He gave a small nod. I will. And thank you for trusting that boy. She smiled softly. That kind of weary kindness that came from surviving too many winters. Faith's the only thing worth trusting anymore. She climbed back into her truck, engine coughing before catching, and started down the mountain trail. Logan watched until her taillights disappeared into the white. Titan padded up beside him, tail brushing his leg. The sky had turned a soft violet now, dusk creeping over the mountains. Logan tightened his gloves and looked toward the path leading back to the bridge, the same path the footprints had followed. Something deep in his chest stirred, that old muscle memory of a mission's beginning, the stillness before motion, the breath before danger. He wasn't a soldier anymore. But that didn't matter. Some instincts didn't die. They just waited. He crouched, brushing the snow with his gloved hand, and found the faint edge of the trail again, half buried by wind. The tracks were leading deeper into the forest, toward the foothills, where the trees grew denser and the air turned heavier. He rose slowly, the twilight washing over his face. Titan, he said quietly. The dog's ears lifted. Looks like we've got work to do again. Titan let out a low bark, and together they started forward. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the distant sound of snow shifting under unseen feet. And as the last light faded behind the ridge, Logan felt something he hadn't felt in years. A mission worth taking. Not for country, not for command, but for the small, voiceless lives that someone had tried to bury in silence. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step erasing the man he had been and shaping the one he was becoming. Ahead, the forest waited, silent, cold, and full of secrets. The track stretched before him, vanishing into the dark. He glanced once at Titan, his oldest friend, and whispered with quiet conviction, "We've got another mission, old boy." The forest had grown darker by the time Logan and Titan followed the last stretch of tracks. The sun was already sinking behind the ridge, bleeding orange light through the trees before vanishing into gray. The temperature dropped fast, and every breath turned to mist. Logan moved carefully through the pines, his boots muffled by the deep snow. Titan padding a few feet ahead, nose low, body tense. The air carried a strange scent. Oil, metal, and something sour that didn't belong in the wilderness. They reached a small valley hidden between two slopes, where the trees grew thick and uneven. In the clearing stood a cluster of wooden sheds, old hunting cabins by the look of them, but too many for hunters, and too organized. Fresh tire tracks cut through the snow. The nearest shack had a generator outside, humming quietly beneath a tarp. Logan crouched behind a fallen log. Eyes narrowed. "Someone's living out here," he whispered. Titan's ears twitched, his body leaning forward. He waited. Minutes passed. Then came a noise. A low bark followed by a man's rough voice shouting, "Quiet down!" Another bark answered, weaker, almost a whimper. Logan's jaw tightened. There were dogs inside, many of them. He slipped his phone from his pocket, switching it to silent, and began recording. As he moved closer, the ground crunched faintly under his boots, every step deliberate. Through a crack in the wooden wall, he could see shadows moving inside. 2 men in heavy jackets, one tall and broad with a shaved head, the other shorter, stocky, his beard unkempt and streaked with gray. They wore work gloves and boots caked with mud. One man kicked a cage. "These ones ain't pure enough," he muttered. The other shrugged. "Doesn't matter, as long as the buyers pay." Logan's stomach twisted. The cages, there were at least 6, holding dogs of all sizes, some Malinois, some shepherds, their fur matted, their eyes dull with fear. It wasn't random cruelty. It was a business, a black market for working dogs, stolen, beaten, resold. He zoomed the camera in, capturing faces, movements, the makeshift pens. He could hear the generator humming and the dogs whining under the men's laughter. He whispered to Titan, "Stay." But Titan's tail was stiff, his eyes burning with silent rage. Then, from behind him, a branch snapped. Logan froze. A voice barked, "Hey, who's out there?" He ducked low, heart pounding, and slid behind the nearest tree. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the snow. "Probably just a coyote," one man grunted. "Check anyway," said the other. Logan crawled backward, careful not to leave deep prints. But the beam found the trail of his boots. "Someone's been here." The voice sharpened. "Grab the gun." Adrenaline hit him like old training kicking in. "Titan, move!" he hissed. The Malinois bolted into the shadows, leading the way as Logan darted downhill. A gunshot tore through the air, splintering a tree trunk inches from his head. Another followed, echoing across the ridge. Snow exploded beside him as he ran. He ducked behind a boulder, breathing hard, clutching his phone tight. The footage was still recording. He turned off the screen, pocketed it, and crawled along the rock face until the gunfire faded. The men shouted somewhere above, their voices bouncing through the trees, angry but uncertain. The night was coming fast now, swallowing everything in blue-gray. Logan signaled to Titan with a low whistle, and the dog appeared silently from behind a cluster of pines, his fur dusted white, his amber eyes alert. "Good boy," Logan whispered. "We're not dying here tonight." They slipped away into the darkness, following the river's frozen edge. By the time the cabin came into view, the sky was black and filled with drifting snow. He hadn't realized how much time had passed. Hours, maybe. The cold had bitten through his gloves, and his lungs burned from the run. But there was something else. A faint sound on the wind. A motor. Not the generator this time. Tires spinning, struggling. Then a dull crash. Logan stopped, listening again. It came from the main road near the bend, where the cliffs curved dangerously close to the forest. He took off running, Titan beside him. As he rounded the corner, headlights flashed weakly from below. Martha Higgins's old pickup truck had slid sideways off the icy road, its rear tires hanging over the ditch. The left headlight flickered, and steam rose from the hood. Logan's stomach dropped. "Martha!" he shouted. Through the windshield, he saw her struggling to open the door. Her face was pale in the dim light, eyes wide with fear. He ran. boots slipping on the ice. "Don't move," he called. "I've got you." The truck creaked as he reached it, the metal groaning under its own weight. Snow and mud mixed beneath his feet. He gripped the door handle, yanked it open, and unbuckled her seatbelt. "Come on," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Grab my arm." Martha's gloved hands trembled as she reached for him. Her face, usually so composed, looked fragile under the glow of the headlights. Her gray hair loose from its pins. Her cheeks flushed red from the cold. I lost control," she stammered. "The road, I know," he said. "We'll talk later." He pulled her free just as the truck gave a shudder and began to slide. With one final heave, he dragged her backward onto the snow, both collapsing to the ground as the vehicle tipped forward, scraping against the embankment before coming to rest nose down in the ditch. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the truck's cooling engine. Then Martha laughed softly, breathless. "Guess the Lord still needs you to pull stubborn women out of ditches." Logan smiled despite the adrenaline burning through him. "Guess so." He helped her to her feet, brushing snow from her coat. "You shouldn't have been driving up here." "I had to," she said, her tone more steady now. "I felt something wasn't right. I came to check on you." She glanced at him, eyes searching. And judging by that look, I was right. He hesitated, then told her everything. The sheds, the cages, the men, the gunfire. Her expression darkened, the warmth fading from her face. "Fool. People who hurt animals like that," she murmured, shaking her head. "There's a special corner of hell waiting for them." He nodded. "I've got footage enough to take to the sheriff, but I need to lay low tonight." "You'll do that," she said firmly, "and you'll do it where it's warm." By the time they reached the cabin, both were covered in frost and exhaustion. The fire was still glowing faintly, waiting like an old friend. Martha sat down slowly, rubbing her arms as Logan threw more logs onto the flames. The warmth spread fast, turning the air golden. Titan lay near the hearth, his head resting protectively beside the puppies. Ranger stirred, letting out a sleepy whimper. Martha smiled faintly at the sight. "They're growing," she whispered. Logan nodded. "They're fighters." She looked at him, her expression gentle but full of meaning. "You know," she said softly, "my husband used to say that when you save one life, it's never just one. It changes everything around it." He glanced at her, unsure how to respond. She reached out and placed her hand lightly over his scarred knuckles. "Logan." Her voice was quiet but steady. "You were meant to open that door." For the first time, he didn't argue. He simply looked at her, the flicker of fire reflecting in his eyes. The darkness that had lived there for so long began to soften. Outside, the wind had calmed. The forest held its breath. Inside, the fire burned bright. And for the first time, Logan's face no longer looked haunted. It looked alive. Morning came quietly, as if the mountain itself had decided to rest. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving behind a world glazed in silver. Inside the cabin, the fire still breathed softly, its light moving like warm water over the wooden walls. Logan stirred first, his back stiff from sleeping in the chair beside the hearth. The smell of burnt wood and fresh coffee lingered faintly in the air. He blinked the fatigue from his eyes and looked toward the cot. Martha Higgins lay under a wool blanket, her face calm but pale. She had twisted her ankle during the accident, and though the bruise had darkened overnight, her spirit seemed untouched. Her gray hair spilled from beneath a knitted cap, the strands catching the light like threads of frost. When she opened her eyes, she smiled faintly. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink," she said, her voice still raspy from exhaustion. Logan poured her a cup of warm water and handed it over. "I've had worse nights," he replied quietly. She took the cup, her hands trembling slightly. "That I believe," she said, her eyes studying him. "You've seen too much for one lifetime, haven't you?" He didn't answer, only added another log to the fire. The flames rose again, painting gold across the floorboards. Titan stretched near the hearth, yawning wide, while Ranger and Ivy scrambled around his paws, their tiny claws clicking against the wood. They chased each other in clumsy circles, their tails wagging furiously, bumping into Martha's boots and making her laugh. It was the first sound of pure joy that had filled the cabin in years. Logan glanced over, surprised by how natural it sounded. "They're already trouble," he muttered. But there was a softness in his tone that hadn't been there before. Martha watched him as he knelt to fix the window by the stove. One of the wooden panes had cracked during the storm, and the cold air whistled through it. Logan measured a plank roughly by eye, cutting it with slow precision, his hands steady, but scarred. The veins along his forearm stood out like old rivers, testimony of years carrying gear heavier than his regrets. He hammered the board in place, the rhythmic sound echoing gently. When he finished, sunlight spilled through a narrow gap between the wood slats. A bright ray crossed the room, landing squarely on Martha's face. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. Logan paused, watching her lips move. "Who are you praying for?" he asked softly. Martha opened her eyes, the sunlight shimmering in them. "For you," she said simply. "For those who forget that they still matter." Logan looked away, uncomfortable with her kindness. "You don't need to do that." "Oh, but I do," she said. "Every night I pray for the lost, the ones who stop believing they could come home. Some find their way back, some don't. I like to think you're one of my answers." He shook his head, half smiling. "I don't think God's been listening to me for a while." Martha leaned back against the pillow. "He listens," she said firmly, "but he doesn't shout back. He waits. Sometimes he sends reminders instead of miracle." Her gaze drifted toward the puppies, now curled up in a heap near Titan. Sometimes those reminders come with fur and 4 paws. Logan laughed quietly. It felt strange, like hearing a sound that belonged to someone else. "You sound like my mother used to," he said. "She must have been a wise woman," Martha replied. He didn't answer. His mother's voice had long since faded from memory, buried under years of sand and snow. But as the light touched his face, he could almost remember it. The softness in her words, the same tone Martha used when she spoke of faith. The day passed slowly. Logan cleaned the stove, patched another draft in the roof, and made a simple stew with what Martha had brought from her pantry. She insisted on helping, but he wouldn't let her. "You rest," he said. "I've got it handled." "You sound like my son," she said with a grin. "Bossy, but kind." "You have a son?" Her smile faded slightly. Had, she corrected gently. Lucas. He was a paramedic, died in a flood trying to save a family trapped in their car. He used to say it wasn't courage that made him do it. It was the thought of what it would feel like not to. Logan didn't know what to say. He stirred the stew quietly, the fire crackling beneath the pot. I'm sorry, he murmured. Martha reached out, placing her hand over his wrist. Her skin was warm despite the cold air. Don't be. He lived the way God built him to, and maybe you're built the same way. You just forgot for a while. He looked at her hand, at the faint tremor that came with age, and felt something shift deep inside, a gentleness he hadn't allowed himself in years. By evening, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and thyme. The wind outside had settled into a hush, the kind of peace that comes only after a storm. Martha ate quietly, thanking him between bites. Ranger and Ivy gnawed on scraps of bread, tails wagging under the table. Titan lay nearby, watching them with patient eyes that seemed older than his 6 years. After dinner, Martha sat by the window, looking out at the moon hanging above the pines. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the glass. You know, she said after a long silence, I asked God last month to show me someone I could help before winter ended. Someone who needed reminding that they still had a reason to wake up. She smiled softly. I didn't expect he'd send a stubborn ex-Marine and 2 frozen puppies to my doorstep. Logan chuckled. He works in mysterious ways. Martha nodded, her expression thoughtful. Maybe he works through broken people so they understand each other better. The fire popped. Logan stared into the flames, his jaw tightening slightly. I spent years thinking if I stayed quiet long enough, the guilt would fade. But it never did. Guilt doesn't leave, Martha said gently. It just waits for forgiveness. And that's not something you earn. It's something you allow. He said nothing more, but when she began to hum a hymn, soft and low, her voice trembling with age, he didn't stop her. The melody wrapped around the cabin like a prayer. Later that night, after Martha had fallen asleep and the fire had died down to embers, Logan sat alone at the table. The puppies slept soundly beside Titan, their small bodies twitching in dreams. Outside, the moonlight painted silver over the snow. He reached for his old notebook, the one that had survived deployments, storms, and years of silence, and opened it to a blank page. For a long moment, he stared at the paper, pen unmoving. Then slowly, he began to write. Maybe saving them was how God saved me. He set the pen down, leaned back, and exhaled. The words sat there, simple, but true. The kind of truth that didn't need explaining. The wind whispered softly through the pines outside, carrying with it the faint echo of Martha's prayer. Inside, the fire flickered once more, and Logan felt, for the first time in years, that he wasn't alone. The mountains never warned twice. The first sign was the wind, a low, distant growl rolling through the pines, like a beast waking from sleep. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of slate, and snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, erasing the trail leading to Logan's cabin. He stood at the window, one hand resting on the wooden frame, watching the storm build. The quiet beauty of the snowfall no longer fooled him. He could feel danger in its rhythm. Somewhere beyond those trees, men were coming. Titan sat at his feet, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the tree line. Ranger and Ivy huddled together near the hearth, their small bodies pressed against each other, trembling at every gust of wind that rattled the glass. The fire threw flickering light across the cabin walls, but it wasn't enough to chase the growing cold. Logan turned toward the stove, loading another log into the flames. His breath came out in small clouds. "They'll come before dark," he muttered. Titan's ears twitched, as if he understood. Outside, the snow thickened into a white curtain. The forest that had always been his refuge now felt smaller, suffocating. He checked the door, the windows, the rifle leaning against the wall. He had cleaned it that morning out of habit, his hand moving with the same precision that had once saved lives. But this time he wasn't fighting for a mission or an order. He was fighting for a home he didn't think he'd ever deserve. He looked down at the puppies curled by the fire. Ranger stirred, his small paw twitching. "You picked the wrong man to hang your hopes on, little one," Logan whispered. But even as he said it, something in his chest pushed back, a steady, quiet refusal to believe it anymore. As the day dimmed, the storm roared to life. Snow hurled itself against the cabin, howling through every gap in the wood. The world outside vanished in white chaos. Then, above the wind, Titan's growl cut through the noise. Logan's head snapped toward the door. The dog stood rigid, ears forward, teeth bared. A shadow passed behind the frosted window. Tall, indistinct, moving slow. Another followed. Logan's heart slammed against his ribs. "They found us," he breathed. He grabbed the rifle, checking the chamber by instinct, then motioned Titan toward the back wall. "Stay low." He crossed the room in 3 strides, peered through a small crack in the boarded window, and saw them. 2 men trudging through the snow, flashlights cutting pale beams through the storm. They were dressed in heavy coats, faces half covered, but he recognized the build, the gait, the same men from the sheds, the ones who'd shot at him. Logan's breath steadied. The soldier in him returned, calm, cold. He pulled the curtain shut and crouched by the fire, whispering. Quiet now. Ranger whimpered softly. Titan pressed his body low, a shadow of muscle and intent. The first knock came hard, 3 sharp bangs that echoed through the wood. "Open up!" a voice shouted, muffled but angry. "We know you're in there." Logan didn't answer. The second man cursed. "You think you can hide a camera, soldier boy? Hand it over, and maybe we won't burn this place down." He glanced toward the corner where his phone lay, its battery nearly dead, but its evidence intact. The footage that could expose everything. He had sent a copy to Martha that morning through a weak signal, just in case. Now it might be the only thing standing between justice and silence. The banging grew louder. The hinges groaned. Logan raised the rifle and exhaled slowly. The storm screamed around them, snow pelting the cabin like fists. And then quiet. The footsteps retreated, crunching through the drifts. He strained to listen. Nothing. Only wind. He turned to Titan. "They're circling." The dog's growl deepened in agreement. Logan checked the back window. Snow blurred everything beyond it. Then, faintly, he saw another light. A second pair of men moving through the trees. 4, maybe 5 total, They were waiting for darkness. Back in town, Martha Higgins felt the storm shake her house. The wind moaned down Main Street, slamming shutters and cutting the power. The bakery's sign outside clanged violently in the gusts. She stood by the window, clutching her coat around her shoulders. Every part of her wanted to drive back into those woods, but the roads were already closed. Instead, she grabbed her shawl and stepped into the freezing air. Snow whipped at her face, blinding her, but she pushed forward toward the church on the hill. The doors were open, candles already lit by a few townsfolk taking shelter. Inside, the air glowed amber and warm. Pastor John stood near the altar, a tall man in his 50s, with a kind face and a voice roughened by decades of winter sermons. When Martha entered, he looked up in surprise. "Martha, in this weather?" She shut the door behind her. "We need to pray," she said firmly. "For Logan Cross." The pastor blinked. "The veteran who lives by Shadow Ridge?" She nodded. "He's out there, John. He's in danger." Within minutes, word spread through the small town. People gathered despite the storm. Farmers, bakers, children wrapped in blankets. Martha stood at the front, her hands clasped tight. "He's one of us," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "A man who lost everything and still opened his door when something needed saving. Tonight, he's fighting again, but not for war, for mercy." Pastor John nodded and lit another row of candles. "Then we pray," he said. "We pray for the soldier in the woods, that God's light will find him through the storm." Soon, the whole of Shadow Creek glowed with candlelight. Windows along Main Street flickered like stars against the darkness. Children pressed their palms to the glass, whispering hope into the snow. And high in the hills, far beyond the town's reach, Logan's cabin stood like a single flame in the blizzard. Inside, the wind battered the walls, trying to snuff it out. Logan rechecked his ammunition, his breath steady. Ranger whimpered again, and he reached down, touching the pup's small head. "It's all right," he whispered. "You stay with Titan." A branch slammed against the roof, shaking the cabin. Then came voices again, closer now, footsteps crunching just outside the door. Logan raised the rifle, eyes narrowing. He could hear his own pulse, the storm blending with it. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a man's voice shouted, "You can't hide forever, soldier." Logan exhaled slowly, eyes on the door. His muscles relaxed, not from surrender, but from clarity. He had fought countless battles for orders that never gave him peace. But this was different. The faces behind him were not comrades. They were his reason. He looked down at Titan, then at the fire. "If this is the last one," he murmured, "at least we're not fighting alone." The storm outside howled an answer, carrying with it the faint echo of church bells from the valley below, barely audible through the wind. But there, all the same, the storm had raged all night, hammering the cabin with wind that howled like ghosts from another life. By the time the first gray light of dawn bled through the cracks in the boarded window, the world outside was a blur of white and shadow. Logan hadn't slept. He sat near the fire with his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the door. Titan lay beside him, every muscle coiled tight, his fur bristling with awareness. Ranger and Ivy huddled close to the hearth, their tiny bodies trembling, unaware of how fragile the morning truly was. A noise cut through the storm, the crunch of boots on hard snow. Then another. Logan's grip tightened. He leaned toward Titan and whispered, "Now it starts." The dog's ears twitched in response, a low growl rising in his throat. The door shook. Once, twice, and then splintered inward with a deafening crack. Snow exploded into the room as two figures stormed in. Heavy coats dusted white, faces masked by scarves and rage. The taller man, the one with the shaved head, held a shotgun. The shorter one carried a crowbar. "Told you we'd find him," the tall man snarled. Logan fired once, a warning shot into the floorboards that sent both men ducking for cover. "Drop it!" he barked. Voice sharp, trained. "You take one more step, and I'll make sure you don't walk back." The tall man laughed coldly. "You think you scare us, soldier? You're outnumbered." His voice cracked, betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Outside, the storm swallowed all sound, but Logan caught it. More footsteps approaching from behind the cabin. His pulse slowed. "Titan," he whispered. The Malinois lunged forward in a blur of mahogany and black, teeth flashing. He hit the shorter man first, knocking him into the wall. The shotgun roared. Splinters flew, grazing Logan's shoulder. The pain was sharp, but clean. He ignored it, driving his elbow into the tall man's ribs. The man grunted, dropping the gun. For a few desperate seconds, chaos ruled the cabin. Titan's growls filled the room as he pinned the man to the floor. The taller one scrambled for his weapon, but Logan kicked it away, grabbing him by the collar. "You hurt those animals," he hissed, "and you came back for me. You made your choice." The man swung wildly, catching Logan across the cheek. Blood stung his eye, but he didn't falter. He slammed the man against the wall, the sound echoing above the storm. Then, through the wind, a faint wail rose, a siren. Logan froze. For a moment, disbelief flickered through him. Then he heard it again, closer this time, growing louder. The tall man cursed. "Cops!" He shoved Logan back, stumbling toward the door, but Titan was faster. The dog lunged again, jaws snapping just inches from the man's arm. The door burst open before either could move, and a flash of light filled the cabin. "Police! Drop your weapons!" Two officers in heavy parkas rushed in, rifles raised. Their badges glinted through the snowlight. Behind them came the familiar figure of Sheriff Hale, a man in his late 50s, with a square jaw and eyes that had seen too many winters. His deep voice cut through the storm. "Hands where I can see them!" The smug grin vanished from the tall man's face. He lifted his hands slowly as the officers cuffed both intruders and hauled them outside. Logan lowered his rifle, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. "Titan, heel," he said softly. The dog obeyed instantly, panting, eyes alert but calm. Logan knelt beside him, running a trembling hand through his fur. "Good boy." "Looks like you had quite the night," Sheriff Hale said, stepping into the cabin. His coat dripped with melting snow, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "We got a call from Mrs. Higgins around midnight. Said you might need some company." Logan wiped the blood from his cheek. "She's got good timing." The sheriff gave him a long, assessing look. "You still know how to handle yourself." "Some things don't fade," Logan said. "Yeah, well," Hale replied. glancing at the two shivering puppies near the fire. "Seems you handled more than yourself this time." Not long after, Martha appeared in the doorway, bundled in a thick wool coat. Her cheeks flushed from the cold and from worry. When she saw Logan standing there, bruised, exhausted, but alive, her eyes filled with tears. "You stubborn fool," she whispered, stepping forward and placing a hand on his arm. "I told you angels watch over good men." He smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure I qualified." "You do now," she said softly. Outside, the storm began to fade, its fury spent. The sky lightened from gray to pearl, and the first rays of dawn spilled across the snow. Townspeople had followed the sheriff's convoy up the mountain. Men, women, even children bundled in scarves and mittens. They gathered quietly around the cabin, some holding candles despite the daylight. The news had spread fast. The soldier who saved the puppies. Martha knelt beside the two small dogs, who wagged their tails timidly. "You see, Logan," she said, looking up at him, "God never forgets. He just waits until we're ready to listen." In the following days, Shadow Creek came alive with stories. Children drew pictures of the man in the woods and his brave dogs, bright crayon skies, snowy cabins, and two small pups with halos of gold above their heads. One picture hung in the church above the altar, framed with care. Beneath it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "The soldier who saved the puppies." Logan stood there one evening, weeks later, as the congregation gathered for Sunday service. He wore a clean shirt and his old jacket, the collar brushed of snow. Martha sat in the front pew, her eyes bright, hands folded in prayer. Sheriff Hale nodded to him from across the aisle. The organ played softly, and candlelight bathed the room in gold. Logan's gaze lingered on the children's drawing, the small cabin under a shining sun, a man and his dog standing side by side. For a long time he just stared. Then slowly, a smile broke across his face. It wasn't wide or forced, but quiet and real, the kind that begins somewhere deep in the soul. For the first time in years, he felt it. The warmth of belonging, the stillness of peace. Tone. He whispered under his breath, "Thank you." Outside, snow fell again, light and harmless this time, covering the world. Not in fear, but in grace, and spring came quietly to Shadow Creek, soft as a hymn. After a long winter, the snow melted into streams that glimmered between the pines, and the mountains breathed again, shedding their white armor for green. Birds returned, singing timidly at first, then louder, as if testing the silence left behind by the storm. The air smelled of pine and earth and beginnings. For the first time in years, Logan Cross woke to something more than survival. He woke to purpose. The old cabin, once a place of exile, now stood at the heart of something new. Wooden beams rose beside it, fresh and strong, built by the hands of townsfolk who had once only whispered his name. They came with hammers, saws, and warm smiles, bringing lumber from their barns and stones from the creek. It wasn't just a building. It was a promise. Above the door, a carved sign read, "Haven of Light." Beneath it, smaller words, "For every soul that still believes." Martha Higgins stood on the porch, watching the volunteers work. Her gray hair fluttered in the mild breeze, her cheeks touched with spring warmth. Though she walked slower now, her steps remained steady, guided by conviction rather than strength. She wore her Sunday coat and a knitted shawl, faded at the edges, but bright where her hands had mended it. When Logan came up beside her, she smiled. It's strange, isn't it? How the same place that once held silence now holds laughter. Logan glanced around. Children were chasing Ranger and Ivy near the fence line. The two dogs, no longer puppies, but young, strong Malinois, bounded through the grass, tails high. Titan watched them from a shady patch by the porch, his muzzle grayer than before, but his eyes still sharp, proud, and calm. They earned it, Logan said. All of them. Martha nodded. So did you. He didn't answer. Just watched as a boy of about 10 dropped his hammer and giggled when Ivy snatched up his glove. The boy's mother, a tall woman named Elena, laughed softly nearby. She had auburn hair tied in a loose braid, freckles across her fair cheeks, and eyes the color of river glass. She had lost her husband the previous winter to illness, and the quiet sadness in her smile told stories she didn't speak aloud. Yet when she worked, she did so with quiet strength, her sleeves rolled up, her hands calloused, but gentle. She reminds me of you, Logan murmured. Martha chuckled. Oh no, she's stronger. I only prayed. She builds. The Haven of Light grew fast. It wasn't just a rescue station. It became a place where wounded hearts found something to care for. Retired workers, widows, and children alike came to feed the strays, mend fences, or just sit in the sun with a wagging tail beside them. Logan trained the younger dogs to follow voice commands, teaching patience and protection. Ranger and Ivy often led the drills, mimicking Titan's discipline. There was a certain poetry in watching them work together. The old soldier and his loyal dogs training the next generation to guard and to comfort. By late April, the building stood finished. Sturdy pine walls, wide kennels, and a porch lined with lanterns waiting to be lit. On the day of the dedication, the whole town gathered under the open sky. The air carried the scent of fresh wood and wildflowers. Pastor John led the ceremony, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. What began as one man's burden, he said, has become a beacon for all who seek light in the dark. When he stepped aside, Martha took his place. She wore her best dress, a simple navy one with a silver brooch in the shape of a cross. Her voice trembled only at first. A year ago, a storm nearly took more than just lives. It nearly took faith. But God does not forget his children. He only waits until they remember how to listen. She looked at Logan, and her eyes glistened. This place, this haven, is proof that he still speaks through kindness. Then with a slow breath, she lifted the first lantern and whispered a prayer. For every soul who once walked in the cold, may this light guide them home. The crowd followed her lead, one by one. They lit their lanterns, small flames flickering against the dusk. Soon the entire clearing shimmered in gold. The glow spread to the porches of nearby houses, then down the valley to the town itself, where more lights appeared like stars waking from slumber. Shadow Creek became a constellation of hope. Children cheered, their laughter ringing like bells. Elena knelt to tie a ribbon around Ivy's collar, whispering something that made the dog's tail wag furiously. Sheriff Hale, standing near the gate, tipped his hat toward Logan. You did good, son, he said. Didn't think I'd ever say that to a Marine off duty. Logan smiled. brushing his hands over his jeans. Guess I finally found a new mission. Looks like you're not retiring from saving lives anytime soon. As twilight deepened, Martha walked slowly toward the cabin and rested her hand on the porch rail. You know, she said softly, when I first prayed for you, I didn't ask for miracles. I just asked God to remind you that the world still needed you. I think he answered more than I hoped. Logan looked out at the field beyond, the lanterns flickering, the people laughing, the dogs running free. The mountains in the distance glowed faintly under the setting sun, streaks of pink and gold brushing the snow still clinging to their peaks. He didn't forget any of us, he said. We just needed to stop hiding. Titan stood beside him now, tail swaying slowly, eyes reflecting the porch light. Ranger and Ivy ran up, panting, tongues lolling happily. They sat at his feet as if waiting for a command. Logan knelt, scratching each behind the ears. You did good, soldiers, he murmured. Martha chuckled. Even heroes need someone to come home to. When night fully fell, the lanterns around the haven still glowed, their light mingling with the stars above. Logan stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden post. The air was cool, but gentle. Titan lay at his feet. Ranger and Ivy nestled close. The cabin behind him hummed with life, soft music, laughter, and the quiet shuffle of Paws. He looked toward the valley where hundreds of porch lights shone back like silent prayers. The reflection of their glow shimmered in the puddles of melted snow. He whispered into the stillness, his voice steady and at peace. We made it home. The wind carried his words into the forest, where they faded into the night, leaving only light behind. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the heavens. They come quietly, in the sound of a puppy's heartbeat, in the warmth of a stranger's hand, in the courage to open a door one more time. Logan's story reminds us that even the most broken hearts can be healed. When we choose compassion over fear, when we let faith guide us instead of pain. Maybe that's how God works, not through grand gestures, but through the small acts of love that rebuild the world one soul at a time. And perhaps tonight, he's reminding you too. No matter how lost you feel, his light still knows your name.